Every era gets the legends it wants to remember. Hollywood's golden age gave America its gods and goddesses, the swashbucklers, the crooners, the screen queens whose faces sold magazines and whose voices sold Christmas. But underneath the glamour, the same age produced some of the most disturbing private stories in American entertainment history. Some of them are proven fact, backed by trial transcripts and sworn testimony. Others are decades-old rumors that were never confirmed and, in at least one case, were later shown to be false. This is an attempt to walk through both clearly and honestly, telling you which is which. Joan Crawford was, for decades, one of the biggest stars the studio system ever built. An Oscar winner, a fashion icon, a woman the press loved to photograph in furs and diamonds. Then, in 1978, a year after her death, her adopted daughter Christina Crawford published a memoir called Mommy Dearest. It described a childhood of obsessive discipline, alcoholism, and physical punishment, including the now infamous scene of a nighttime rage over a wire coat hanger left in a closet. Christina wrote of being pulled by the hair, of forced cleanliness rituals, and of a mother who could switch from warmth in public to violence in private. It's worth saying plainly, this account has always been contested. Joan Crawford's surviving relatives and several people who worked with her, including her twin daughters, publicly disputed large parts of the book, and a website run by family members has spent years cataloging what they say are contradictions between Christina's sworn legal statements and the memoir. What is not in dispute is the historical record around it. When Joan Crawford's was read in 1977, Christina and her adopted brother Christopher were left out entirely, with a line stating they were excluded for reasons which are well known to them. They contested the will and were eventually awarded a settlement. Whatever the full truth of the household was, the collision between Crawford's manicured public image and her daughter's private account became one of the defining Hollywood scandals of the 20th century, and it permanently reshaped how the public thought about the distance between a star's image and a star's home life. Bing Crosby was, by any measure, the most successful entertainer in America for a long stretch of the mid-20th century. A crooner whose recording of White Christmas remains the best-selling single ever released, and a man Life magazine and the press regularly held up as the model American father. That image cracked in 1983, 6 years after his death, when his eldest son, Gary Crosby, published a memoir, Going My Own Way, describing a childhood of rigid discipline and physical punishment inside the family's Los Angeles mansion. The reaction from Crosby's own children split down the middle. His brother Lindsay initially said he was glad Gary had written it, saying he hoped it would clear up a lot of the old lies and rumors, though he later said he preferred to remember the good times. Dennis, another son, also came to side with Gary's account. Their brother Philip pushed back hard, insisting their father was strict but not the man Gary described, and accusing his brother of exaggeration. What isn't disputed is what happened afterward. Lindsay Crosby died by suicide in December 1989, and Dennis Crosby died by suicide in May 1991. Whether their deaths were connected to their childhood, as some who wrote about the family believed, or driven primarily by addiction, divorce, and other adult struggles, as others argued, is something no document can settle for us. What the Crosby family story does show clearly is how far a beloved public image could sit from a family's private reality, and how that gap could outlive the star himself by decades. Errol Flynn became an overnight legend after the adventures of Robin Hood, and Hollywood built an image of him as the dashing, mischievous ideal of masculinity. In 1942, that image collided with the law. Flynn was charged with 3 counts of statutory rape after 2 teenagers, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley, told police he had had sexual relations with them while they were underage. The case went to trial in January and February of 1943, a genuinely sensational courtroom event, with crowds mobbing the courthouse and thousands of letters of support pouring in from fans. Flynn's attorney, the celebrity lawyer Jerry Geisler, built the defense around discrediting the accuser's accounts and their credibility on the stand. After roughly a day of deliberation, the jury, deliberately selected to include 9 women, returned a unanimous not guilty verdict on all counts. It is important to be precise here. Errol Flynn was tried by a jury of his peers and acquitted. That is the historical record. The trial nonetheless permanently attached a shadow to his name, gave rise to the slang phrase "in like Flynn," and fed a decades-long stream of rumor about parties at his home, some of it substantiated by people who knew him, much of it never independently verified. He died in 1959 at 50, and the contrast between his on-screen heroism and the scandal that trailed him remains one of the starkest examples of how Golden Age Hollywood could simultaneously celebrate and gossip about the same man. For years, one particular story circulated in whispers around Hollywood, that a teenage Natalie Wood had been sexually assaulted by a powerful, much older movie star. The 2001 biography Natalie Wood, the complete biography by Suzanne Finstad, repeated the account without naming the man involved. The rumor became so persistent that when a famous older actor died in 2020 at the age of 103, Natalie Wood's name began trending alongside his on social media, purely because of the decades-old speculation. That actor was Kirk Douglas. In November 2021, Wood's younger sister, Lana Wood, published a memoir called Little Sister, in which she stated for the first time, publicly and by name, that Douglas had sexually assaulted Natalie in the summer of 1955, when Natalie was 16 and Douglas was in his late 30s. Lana wrote that their mother had arranged the meeting at the Chateau Marmont Hotel, hoping Douglas's stature might open doors for Natalie's career, and that Natalie returned to the car that night disheveled and shaken, telling her years later, as an adult, "He hurt me." Lana said she had promised her sister she'd keep the secret to protect her career, and only felt free to break that promise once no one from that generation remained to protect. Douglas's son, actor Michael Douglas, responded through a publicist with a brief statement. May they both rest in peace. It is worth being clear about the nature of this evidence. It is a serious, detailed allegation, corroborated in outline by an earlier biography that didn't name names, but it rests on the word of family members recounting events from nearly 70 years ago, about two people who are no longer alive to respond. Natalie Wood herself died in 1981 in a drowning off Catalina Island that was originally ruled accidental and was later reclassified, and whose exact circumstances remain formally unresolved. Sal Mineo, the Oscar-nominated star of Rebel Without a Cause, was stabbed to death outside his West Hollywood apartment on the night of February 12, 1976. He was 37. Neighbors heard him crying out and found him in the carport alley behind his building. He died before an ambulance could save him. Because his wallet was untouched, investigators initially suspected the motive was personal rather than a simple robbery. And because Mineo was one of the few openly gay actors of his generation, speculation at the time often centered on his private life. The truth, when it emerged, was far less mysterious than the rumors. In 1977, a man named Lionel Williams was overheard in a Michigan jail bragging to another inmate about the killing. Williams's own wife eventually told detectives that he had come home covered in blood the night of the murder, told her he had stabbed a man, and later, upon seeing a news report, said, "That's the dude I killed." Williams was tried and convicted of Mineo's murder in 1979. Prosecutors concluded it had been a botched robbery. Mineo had fought back, and Williams stabbed him and fled with nothing. In recent years, some criminal justice advocates have questioned the conviction, pointing to early witness descriptions of a taller, blonde assailant that didn't match Williams. But the case, unlike so many Golden Age scandals, did go through a full police investigation, a trial, and a conviction, a rare instance where a Hollywood tragedy wasn't buried, but actually adjudicated in open court. If Golden Age Hollywood had a signature rivalry, it was the one between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, two of the era's biggest stars who reportedly despised each other for decades, a hostility some biographers trace back to competition over roles and over men in the 1930s. Their mutual dislike reached its peak during the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? In 1962, a production that has generated one of Hollywood's most repeated legends. That during one scene Davis kicked Crawford hard enough in the head to draw blood and require stitches, and that Crawford retaliated by wearing a weighted belt or filling her pockets with rocks, so that Davis would strain her back, dragging her across the floor in a later scene. These stories are told constantly in biographies, documentaries, and the 2017 FX series Feud. Bet and Joan, but fact-checkers have repeatedly noted there is no contemporaneous, verifiable documentation that either incident happened exactly as described. They exist mainly as oft-repeated anecdotes from people connected to the production, embellished over 60 years of retelling. What is documented is the genuine, long-running personal animosity between the two women, some of it rooted in real events like Davis reportedly having an affair with Crawford's husband Frank Catone in the 1930s. Crawford herself, later in life, pushed back on the entire narrative, telling interviewers there was never a feud, because it takes two to tango, and I refuse to fight. Whether that was a genuine reassessment or a final performance for the cameras, even she couldn't say for certain, which tells you something about how thoroughly image management defined that generation of stars. Wallace Beery, an MGM star who won an Oscar for The Champ, spent decades trailed by one of the strangest rumors in studio history. Ted Healy, the vaudeville performer who created the act that became the Three Stooges, died suddenly in December 1937, hours after being involved in a drunken altercation outside the Café Trocadero nightclub on the Sunset Strip. For decades afterward, a persistent story circulated that Healy had been beaten to death that night by three men, one of whom was Wallace Beery, and that MGM's powerful publicity machine covered it up to protect its stars. The story was repeated in books, in a widely cited Wikipedia entry for years, and in Hollywood folklore generally. Here is the important and less sensational part of the story. Journalists who went back to the original 1937 newspaper coverage and coroner's findings found that the official autopsy concluded Healy died of acute nephritis brought on by chronic alcoholism, not blunt force trauma, and that even Healy's own ex-wife, who had initially and loudly alleged to cover up and pushed for a formal inquiry, ultimately told the district attorney's office she was satisfied there had been no foul play. No inquest was ever held, because the death was legally classified as natural causes. A minor altercation involving Beery, the mobster-connected Pat DiCicco, and a young Albert Cubby Broccoli, later the producer of the James Bond films, did take place that night, and Beery reportedly threw the first punch. But detailed newspaper-era research into the case has found the Beery beat Healy to death version to be, in the words of one researcher who spent months on the original files, simply false. It's a useful reminder that not every Golden Age cover-up story holds up once you go back to the primary sources. Some of the darkest Hollywood legends are darker in the retelling than they ever were in the courthouse record. Gloria Swanson reigned as one of the biggest stars of the silent era, known as much for her extravagant lifestyle as for her acting. In 1928, she starred in and financed Queen Kelly, an ambitious production directed by the notoriously perfectionist Erich von Stroheim. The shoot became legendary for its success. Von Stroheim's demands for authenticity and scale sent the budget spiraling, and Swanson, alarmed by both the costs and the increasingly dark direction of the script, eventually had him fired from his own picture. The film was never properly finished or released in the United States during the silent era. It survives today mostly as a fragment and as a case study in how the unchecked ambitions of both a director and a star could sink a production. Decades later, Swanson found a strange kind of redemption playing a faded, delusional former silent star in Sunset Boulevard, a role many critics and audiences immediately read as an echo of her own career, whether she intended it that way or not. Mickey Rooney was, for a stretch in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the single biggest box office draw in America, thanks largely to the wholesome Andy Hardy film series. His off-screen life was considerably messier. He was married 8 times, filed for bankruptcy after struggling with gambling, and by his final years was, by his own account, essentially penniless. What makes Rooney's story genuinely striking isn't a hidden scandal from his stardom. It's what happened at the very end of his life, and it inverts the usual beloved star, secret monster pattern entirely. In 2011, at 90 years old, Rooney obtained a restraining order against his stepson, Christopher Aber, alleging that Aber and his wife had verbally, emotionally, and financially abused him, withholding food, medicine, and even his own mail, and diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars of his money. Rooney then testified in person before a United States Senate Committee on Aging, describing years of feeling trapped, scared, used, and frustrated, and said, "For years I suffered silently, unable to muster the courage to seek the help I knew I needed. A Los Angeles court later appointed a permanent conservator to manage his affairs. Rooney's testimony became one of the most cited pieces of public advocacy against elder financial abuse in America, and it's a sobering coda to a career that began with him as the country's most powerful child star. One of old Hollywood's most famous names ended his life not as an accused villain, but as a documented victim, in a case that actually went before Congress. Taken together, these stories don't prove that Golden Age Hollywood was secretly run by monsters behind every marquee name. What they show is something a little more specific and in some ways more useful. That the studio system built its business on tightly managed images, and that publicity departments, friendly press, and the sheer economic value of a star's reputation created enormous pressure on victims, on family members, and sometimes on journalists to stay quiet, however different the private reality might have been. Some of the darkest stories here, like Errol Flynn's trial or Kirk Douglas's alleged assault of Natalie Wood, are backed by real testimony and real legal proceedings. Others, like the Wallace Beery rumor, turn out to be exaggerated folklore that doesn't survive contact with the primary sources. And at least one story, Mickey Rooney's, flips the whole hidden villain formula on its head entirely. The honest way to think about old Hollywood's underside isn't as a tidy list of good guys and evil guys. It's as a set of individual, carefully documented cases, some proven, some alleged, some outright myth, that together say more about how the studio system protected its investments than about any single star's private character. The glow of the marquee always told one story. The court records, the memoirs, and the Senate hearing room told several different ones, and it's worth knowing which is which before deciding what to believe.